In the election of 1828, Andrew Jackson was carried into office by a popular landslide. His supporters included Western farmers, Eastern wage earners, and Southerners who expected that Jackson would reduce the tariff. The traditional view of the age of Jackson is that his supporters were evidence of a new democratic revolution, and that the common man supported Jackson, the Democrat, against the more aristocratic national Republican John Quincy Adams. But a closer look at Jackson's supporters might lead us to assume that more was going on here. Historians are pretty confused about Jackson and the meaning of the election of 1828. For some folks, Jackson represents the spirit of that Western entrepreneur against Eastern commercial interests. For others, like Arthur Schlesinger, Jackson is a sort of predecessor of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He offered a New Deal in the 1820s. So what's the story? Who voted for Jackson and why? Lots of folks were interested in voting for Jackson, uh, drawn in by the election propaganda. Voters may have supported the image of Jackson, the great general on a white horse, more than the values. Some elements of politics simply don't change. As usual, most voters vote on a non-rational basis most of the time. Now, non-rational doesn't mean the same as irrational. It doesn't mean they're crazy. It just means that other ideas, other than issues, other than policy, guide their actions. Most voters vote on a non-rational basis, but let's flatter the voters of 1828 and assume that they responded to issues. So who voted for Jackson? Well, debtors. Debtors voted for Jackson because they thought he favored cheap money, easier to pay off their debts. State bankers wanted the national bank gone because it restrained their ability to issue lots of money. The South supported Jackson because his supporters led them to believe that he would reduce tariffs. Some urban laborers voted for Jackson because they like cheap money too. They make more money when money is inflated. Folks who wanted to pick a winner because that was how they could acquire places and government patronage, appointments, and so forth. There was certainly a bandwagon effect as well. Not every state voted at the same time, so as it became more and more apparent that Jackson would win, more and more people voted for Jackson. And of course, there's also simply the great paladin, the statue of Jackson in Jackson Square in New Orleans, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. So there are all kinds of reasons why people voted for Jackson. His supporters represented a pretty mixed bag, looking at such diverse individuals as Martin Van Buren of New York and John Calhoun of South Carolina. It's difficult to figure out what the party had in common. In the election, Democrats offered folks whatever would sell in their region, and since there was no TV and no cable, no national newspapers, they often offered the voters in one area, one state, one region, what they knew they wanted. As we saw last week, in a more broadly democratic America, people who run for public office want to give the voters what they want. The election of 1824 was pretty interesting. There were four favorite sons, all presumably members of the Republican Party who ran for president in 1824. They were regional favorites. Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, Henry Clay of Kentucky, William Crawford of Georgia, and John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts. Jackson received the largest number of electoral votes, but there was no majority. As a result of that, the candidates were forced to go into the House of Representatives to decide who would be president. And Jackson learned that Henry Clay gave his support to John Quincy Adams. A deal had been struck between Clay and Adams. Henry Clay would be Secretary of State if Adams got the presidency. And so Jackson was convinced that a corrupt political deal had been made between Adams and Clay, and he was probably right to rob him of the presidency. His friends were determined that there would never again be such a, quote, corrupt bargain that would keep Jackson out of the presidency in 1828. So as a result of this corrupt bargain, John Quincy Adams became President of the United States, and Henry Clay became Secretary of State. Both Adams and Clay were members of the Republican Party that referred to themselves as National Republicans. They wanted to use federal funding to pay for local improvements in the states and areas of the country, to build highways, to build canals, to do all sorts of things. They were pro-Bank of the United States. We'll talk more about that a little later. And as a result of this, Jackson and his most important followers created a new political party, ended the era of good feelings by creating the Democratic Party. They were convinced that this new party would be the winners of the 1828 election, and as we're going to see, they were absolutely right. John Quincy Adams' administration met with one frustration after another. Congress refused to follow his nationalist program of building roads, canals, and strengthening the Navy. The Senate quarreled with him over Latin American foreign relations. The Georgia legislature ignored his claim that that state had to honor treaties made with the Cherokee Indians. The British government saw him as an ineffectual snob and refused to settle outstanding differences between the two countries. As a result, Adams' first term in office would become his only term in office. The election of 1828 had a carnival flavor. Jacksonians described the election as a contest between democracy, Jackson, and aristocracy, John Adams. Adams was shown up to be a would-be monarch, a parasite, an enemy of the common people. Jackson was portrayed as the hero of the Indian Wars, a frontier paladin, one of the common men. Adams' supporters retaliated, described Jackson as an inexperienced country bumpkin, an incompetent, a hot-headed, drunken, murderous adulterer. They said that Jackson had stolen his wife from another man, well, which was partly true, and that he had murdered several men in cold blood. Actually, he had killed quite a few people in duels. As the election approached, the mudslinging got worse and worse. Jackson's complete support gave him the presidency in 1828. He carried the popular vote by a landslide, and he carried the electoral vote by 178 to 83. Adams only carried New England, New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware. Now, Jackson knew that he could not govern without the wholehearted support of his party, and he began his presidency much as Thomas Jefferson had, with the wholesale dismissal of national Republicans from government service and their replacement with his own friends and political supporters. Jackson did something that had never been done before. Inaugurational balls and celebrations were usually only for the elite of Washington, D.C., but Jackson opened the White House yard to anybody who wanted to come and celebrate. Thousands came to Washington, D.C. from all over the country to celebrate the inauguration of President Andrew Jackson. Vast quantities of booze were served to the folks on the yards of the White House, and it was one of the great celebrations ever to take place in Washington, D.C. Chief Justice, or a Justice of the Supreme Court, a fellow by the name of Story, an old Federalist, watched the celebration from across the street from the White House. He said in his diary that day, "It was a triumph for King Mob." Jackson filled his cabinet with men to whom he owed political favors and to friends of John C. Calhoun. Calhoun thought that he would be able to run the show, that Jackson would be sort of a puppet, and turned out Calhoun was very wrong. The real movers and shakers of his administration were his real advisors, were an informal group of important and influential party hacks and newspaper editors whose main job was to make decisions on the fly and to shape and create public opinion. This informal group that was extraordinarily important in Jackson's cabinet was called by his critics his kitchen cabinet. Get it? Kitchen cabinet. People mostly that you've never heard of. The most important member of the kitchen cabinet was Jackson's close advisor and friend, a New York politician by the name of Martin Van Buren. Now, Jackson's vice president was John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. Van Buren would become Jackson's second vice president. Jackson filled his cabinet with men to whom he owed political favors and to friends of John C. Calhoun. Calhoun thought that he would be able to run the show, that Jackson would be sort of a puppet, and turned out Calhoun was very wrong. The real movers and shakers of his administration were his real advisors, were an informal group of important and influential party hacks and newspaper editors whose main job was to make decisions on the fly and to shape and create public opinion. This informal group that was extraordinarily important in Jackson's cabinet was called by his critics his kitchen cabinet. Get it? Kitchen cabinet. People mostly that you've never heard of. The most important member of the kitchen cabinet was Jackson's close advisor and friend, a New York politician by the name of Martin Van Buren. Now, Jackson's vice president was John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. Van Buren would become Jackson's second vice president. Programs and policies? Well, outside of a vicious hatred for the Second Bank of the United States, mostly Jackson and his cronies formed them on the fly, based on public opinion. Reform and clean government? Well, hardly. The Jackson appointments were just as corrupt as the Adams men had been, who were removed, and frequently more so. Jackson had no real formal principles of government. Problems were handled as they came along, on the fly. In fact, his critics called his system of government an adhocracy. Jackson and his party had no discernible overriding ideology beyond a few vague principles. First, at least a rhetorical belief in white male equality and equal opportunity. Second, a real belief in the necessity of national party unity. Third, a very Jeffersonian view of how America should work. A Jeffersonian focus on agriculture over industry, on states' rights over federal power, over a Jacksonian view of the limits of federal government. Jackson took all of these ideas, these Jeffersonian ideas, very seriously. Like Jefferson before him, Jackson understood that in a republic, image counts as much as reality, that public opinion is what keeps politicians in power. Jackson also understood that in order to make it as a political figure and as a party in American politics, you had to have national support. Regional support would not win national elections, would not win presidencies, and would not win support for a sitting president. A party that only had regional support could not forge an effective national party that could consistently win elections. Jackson's administration was marred by a series of social and political problems, which had a fairly negative effect on his first term in office. A central figure of almost all of Jackson's difficulties was his vice president, John C. Calhoun, and the vice president's wife, Floride Calhoun. Social difficulties made the problems between Jackson and Calhoun even worse. Trouble arose in Washington over the refusals of various officials' wives to accept Peggy Eaton. Peggy was the wife of Secretary of War John Eaton, a close friend of Jackson's, and Mrs. Calhoun led a movement to snub Peggy Eaton because Mrs. Eaton had been the daughter of an innkeeper in Washington, D.C. Her original name is Peggy O'Neill. Jackson supported the Eatons. He refused to go to any social occasion to which the Eatons had not been invited. His friendship was further dampened beyond the Eaton malaria, as it was called, when he received an anonymous letter that suggested that Calhoun had attempted to have Jackson recalled and court-martialed during the First Seminole War in 1818. Jackson had overstepped the limits placed on him by President James Monroe, and Calhoun, Secretary of War at the time, had recommended to Monroe that Jackson be court-martialed as a result. Monroe refused to do it, allowed Jackson a certain amount of levity in what he was doing. But nevertheless, Jackson, during the middle of the Eaton malaria, received an anonymous letter, probably from Martin Van Buren, telling the whole story of Calhoun's attempt to have him tried and court-martialed for insubordination. Jackson's policy toward Native Americans is what he is probably the most famous for in this contemporary era. He proposed more than 90 Indian treaties during his administration, and these treaties were meant to force Native Americans off their lands to a broad Indian territory west of the Mississippi River. Trouble developed with several tribes who refused to leave their ancestral homes. The Sacs and Fox Indians in Illinois were crushed by the Illinois militia as a result. The Cherokee Nation in Georgia resisted the attempt to take their lands by filing suit in the Supreme Court. Their treaties were upheld by Chief Justice John Marshall, but Jackson moved them anyway. He told Marshall, you really shouldn't try to make decisions you can't enforce. And this movement of Native Americans west is referred to as the Trail of Tears. The rift between Jackson and Calhoun went deeper than first met the eye. It was closely associated with the controversy over the protective tariff and a fundamental question of the nature of the Union created by the Constitution. During the decade that followed the passage of the Tariff of 1816, the South had begun to oppose tariffs in general and the Tariff of 1816 in particular. South Carolina led the opposition. When Calhoun had advocated protection, which he did, in 1816, he had expected his state to share in the industrialization of the nation. But South Carolina, like most of the lower states, became dedicated to cotton cultivation. As the production of cotton in the South grew, cotton prices steadily decreased. The planters of many of the southern states sold much of their cotton to foreign markets, especially Britain. Tariffs on foreign imports forced southern planters to pay higher prices. New England textile interests hoped that the tariff would force southern cotton producers to sell their cotton to them at a lower price than the growers could get in Britain. They wanted to raise tariffs in order to protect the cotton industry in the Northeast. Northeastern industrialists and farmers from the Middle States and the West supported a strong nationalistic and protectionist program, supported and proposed by Henry Clay of Kentucky. A protectionist bill was introduced in the Senate in 1820. It failed by one vote. A second bill was raised that passed in 1824 that raised tariffs. In 1828, a convention of textile millers recommended even higher tariffs. As a result, the new tariff bill was introduced in Congress in 1828. The tariff bill of 1828 resulted from an attempt by Jackson supporters to persuade both pro and anti-tariff elements that Jackson was on their side. Jackson was running for president. His supporters were trying to get support from both sides. If Jackson supported the tariff, he would lose a lot of Southern support. If he was against the tariff, he would lose support from the West and from New England. So Jackson's supporters in Congress persuaded Southern congressmen that if they pushed the duty rates to outrageously high levels, even the New Englanders would be shocked by the rates and abandon the bill. In fact, New Englanders were pleased as punch. The ridiculously inflated rates made them as happy as they could be. The bill passed, and Southerners were outraged, especially Southerners from South Carolina. Calhoun tried to convince his fellow South Carolinians to wait and see whether or not Jackson would veto the bill. As it became more and more obvious that Jackson might not, Calhoun decided to come up with a new plan. He decided to pass a states' rights plan through public opinion that would nullify the tariff. And this plan is called nullification. Calhoun devised a formula called nullification as a check against high tariffs or other issues that might affect states' rights. He based his ideas on Jefferson's compact theory of the Constitution. Nullification is based on the premise that each state is sovereign. He proposed that a state convention could be held in a state to determine whether federal law was constitutional. If the state legislature, if the state found the law was unconstitutional, then the state legislature could call a convention, and that convention would pass a state ordinance that would have the effect of nullifying the federal law. The state law would simply prevent local enforcement of the federal law. South Carolina's legislature called a state convention that passed a series of resolutions condemning the 1828 tariff as unconstitutional. Now, at that time, Calhoun was running for vice president on Jackson's ticket. He urged the state to wait and see how Jackson would handle the tariff situation. Jackson was worried about the nullification movement. He held a deep belief in the rights of the states, but he was also convinced that this would threaten the Union. In 1830, a debate broke out over federal limitation on public land sales in the Senate. During this debate, the question of nullification was raised. South Carolina Senator Robert Haney supported both the West and also Calhoun's nullification formula. He rose to explain nullification, and at that point, Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts began an argument with Haney. The Haney-Webster debate, as it was called, drifted from the question of public land sales into the question of whether the Union was operating under the Constitution. Webster enunciated the notion that nullification was a menace to the federal system, a vile attempt to shatter the Union. That any attempt to dismember the Union, said Webster, was treason and would lead to civil war. Soon after the debate, the rift between Jackson and Calhoun became terribly obvious. At a federal Jeffersonian dinner, a thing that the Democratic Party did every year to celebrate Jefferson's birthday, Jackson made a toast while looking directly at Calhoun. To our federal union, Jackson said, it must be preserved. Now, at this moment, Calhoun realized, as Jackson was looking directly at him when he made the toast, at this moment, Calhoun realized that Jackson knew that he was the author of nullification. Calhoun was visibly stirred nervously. He rose when his turn came. He raised his cup in a shaking hand and unsteadily said, "To the Union, next to our liberty most dear." Shortly thereafter, Calhoun resigned from the vice presidency and went back to South Carolina, seemingly a broken man. And yet, the state of South Carolina selected him to fill a Senate seat, so back to Washington he went, this time to represent the state of South Carolina in the United States Senate. On July 14th, 1832, Jackson signed the tariff bill into law. The duties had been lowered somewhat by the time it was passed, but the South Carolina legislature promptly passed a resolution for a convention to consider the constitutionality of the act. On November 24th, 1832, the state convention passed an ordinance that stated that the tariff acts of 1828 and 1832 were null and void. Duties would not be collected in the state of South Carolina. The ordinance concluded that South Carolina would secede from the Union if the federal government used force to enforce the tariffs. Jackson was determined to enforce federal law. He warned South Carolina that nullification was incompatible with the preservation of the Union. Jackson stationed warships in Charleston Harbor, and Congress passed the Force Act, which said essentially that the federal government could use force to enforce federal law in the states. Now, at this point, South Carolina is literally on the verge of secession. Over the next several weeks, Henry Clay was able to create a new tariff, a compromise tariff, that would allow South Carolina essentially to back down. And that was then the end of the nullification crisis. In order to talk about Jackson's animosity toward the Second Bank of the United States, it's necessary to give you some background on the controversy. There was no national bank during the War of 1812. The first Bank of the United States charter had died, and it had not been renewed. There was no national bank during the War of 1812, and many politicians felt that one of the reasons the U.S. had done so badly in the early period of the war was that it was difficult for the national government to get funds in order to prosecute the war. So in 1816, Congress chartered a new bank. Like its predecessor, the Second Bank of the United States was private, but provided funds and regulation for the national government. It was also designed to regulate and curb state banks by providing them with loans to be repaid with currency, with specie. If the bank had been run well, it might have served its purpose better. The man chosen to run the bank when it first opened was William Jones. Now, Jones was a good politician and a lousy banker. It wasn't that he was personally dishonest, but there were a lot of dishonest people in the bank, and Jones didn't do anything about it. The real problem was that Jones exerted virtually no control over either the 18 branch banks of the BUS, the Bank of the United States, or over the state banks. State banks borrowed millions of dollars from the BUS, and the National Bank exerted no pressure to get the loans back. As a result, state banks increased their spending, printed enormous amounts of banknotes, confident that the National Bank would leave them alone. The bank under Jones was not regulating the economy as it should have been, and the result was inflation. In 1819, Jones was replaced with Langdon Cheves. Now, Cheves was a lousy politician, but an excellent banker. He reviewed the bank's books and found that there were millions of dollars in overdue outstanding loans, and he began to recall them. In addition to insisting on repayment, he also began to require that state banks show some kind of security in order to get further loans. Many state banks were unable to secure new funds and were forced ultimately to close their doors. This tightened monetary policy caused something called the Panic of 1819. Many Americans lost their saving. The banks closed. Millions blamed the Depression on the Second Bank of the United States. In fact, most of the problems were caused by unsound state banking practices. But there was already a prejudice among a great many Americans over banks in general and national banks in particular. Local businessmen and savers placed the blame for their misfortune on the BUS. It acquired the name the Monster. And Jackson used this as a ready-made rant in his rhetoric when he ran for office in 1828. He could champion debtors, which was most small farmers and land speculators, most workers and small businessmen, by raging against the monster. 9 years later, Jackson would ask, "For whom is the nation run? Wealthy businessmen from the East who were benefited by the bank, or for the common man?" The question would be very effective, if a little simplistic. After all, no one benefited from a depression, but it probably put him in the White House in 1828. In the campaign of 1832, Henry Clay was running against Andrew Jackson. Jackson was running for a second term. Henry Clay was running for president for the third or fourth time. Clay was convinced that the Bank of the United States was popular. Now, why he was convinced of that, I couldn't begin to tell you. It had put Jackson in office in 1828, his animosity toward the bank, but Clay was convinced that the Bank of the United States would win him the election. Now, the charter for the Bank of the United States would expire in 1836. That is, after Jackson would have gone out of office after a second term. And it could have just been left alone. But Clay decided to make it a campaign, in fact, his only campaign focus. He went to Nicholas Biddle, who Andrew Jackson calls Tsar Nicholas. Biddle was the head of the bank at the time. He went to Nicholas Biddle and persuaded Biddle to go to the federal government, go to Congress, and ask for a new charter. Now remember, that wasn't necessary because the bank charter didn't run out till 1836. So Biddle went to the Senate, went to Congress, and asked for a new charter. The new charter, the majority of members of Congress were Democrats and had no interest in renewing the bank. But Jackson told them to vote for a new charter. Congress passed a new charter for the Bank of the United States, and Jackson vetoed it. His veto message was very specific. He maintained that the bank was unconstitutional. He added it had become a dangerous monopoly. It benefited foreigners and foreign investors and wealthy Easterners at the expense of poor workers and farmers. Clay miscalculated badly. He failed to consider both the popularity of Jackson and the unpopularity of the Bank of the United States. Jackson defeated Clay soundly in the election of 1832, and he interpreted his re-election as a popular mandate to destroy the bank. He was convinced that Nicholas Biddle was mismanaging the bank, and that as a result, it was nearly bankrupt. Jackson asked the Secretary of the Treasury to quit using the bank as a depository for federal funds. When the secretary refused, Jackson fired him and appointed Roger Taney as the new bank secretary on the condition that Taney would draw all federal surpluses out of the Bank of the United States. Taney did that, and he placed the federal revenues in a bunch of little state banks that he trusted that became known as Jackson's pet banks. Pet banks. When the National Bank's charter ran out in 1836, it simply became a Pennsylvania state bank, and Jackson had defeated the monster essentially by starving it to death.